Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our afternoon session, first one of the afternoon. And I'm delighted to be joined by Howard Passy, Director of Operations and Principal Consultant at the Fire Protection Association. Before we start, hopefully if you've been joining us for other sessions, you'll know how this works, but we have a live discussion panel, and you can put your questions on there for Howard, and I'll ask those at the end. And if you also can chat to other delegates on there as well. So please use that. It's on the live discussion tab on your screen. So welcome, Howard. Thank you for joining us today. So obviously you're currently the Director of Operations and Principal Consultant at the Fire Protection Association. And I understand you've been through your career working on a number of fire safety audits, strategy developments and reviews, and currently advising on safety legislation and practice, particularly regarding building design and construction. So for today's session, I know obviously following Grenfell, and following the BSI publication of PAS 911, there's a fire strategy and to provide a clear and safe set of measures encompassing fire precautions, management of fire safety and fire protection. So really, I understand today, Howard, you're going to be setting out how building fire strategies can allow owner-occupiers, construction firms, everybody to build with confidence and safety in mind. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks very much. Excuse me for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, just while I share my screen and make sure that you can see what I want you to see. Press that, and then I think I have to change my display settings. So hopefully now you can just see the screen with my presentation on it. Yes, again, thanks very much, Nathan, and for UK Construction Week for inviting me to speak. The subject matter I've been asked to cover is, as Nathan explained, about building fire strategies and what are they, when are they required, is there a legislative driver for them, what should they contain, and I suppose, who do you ask to help you with developing them, and are they important, I suppose. So I've got a number of slides to run through, as I'm sure you'd expect, and look forward to taking any questions that you may have later. So I shall press on. First question, I suppose, is what is a fire strategy? Well, in broad terms, it's something that should set out the level of protection that's built into the structure of a building and the arrangements in relation to the passive and active fire safety systems, their maintenance, the management of the premises, evacuation procedures and evacuation strategies and such like. And the result should be from a strategy is that if a fire were to occur, then you're able to accurately predict the extent of damage and disruption that's likely to be caused, and thereby have contingencies in place to restore the business to normal. Of course, the primary function has got to be about life safety. It's got to be about ensuring that premises are safe for people to occupy and that they can evacuate from them safely. But I think that I think people and clients in particular, building owners and occupiers, are becoming to realise that there's a bit more to fire safety than just about saving life. Yes, that's the minimum requirement, but do we need to look any further? Commonly, fire strategies will be developed in support of a new build or some form of refurbishment project, and the idea being is that you develop this strategy so that moving forward, not only do you have the necessary contingencies in place, but you have a document that clearly explains exactly how the building functions from a fire safety perspective. And the benefits of that is that for all those involved in the process, they have a clear understanding of what's required. Because for many building owners, building occupiers, maintenance of the premises might be outsourced to others. Other contractors who come in and do their work or do it well or don't do it so well, and there's a potential to become removed from what really needs to happen, what really has to go on, in order to ensure that the safety of the building is maintained. And it's the strategy that helps that. But in addition to that, we found as an organisation, certainly post-Grenfell, that although we continue to do lots of fire risk assessment work, we continue to do compartmentation surveys and fire door surveys, we continue to do dangerous substances and explosive atmospheres assessments as well. But more and more so now, we are being asked to undertake what we call retrospective fire strategies for organisations, businesses and premises owners who are not really clear what they've got. And I think that argument could be made for Grenfell, that although there was some clarity over the type of cladding that was put onto the building, despite the fact that it was inappropriate, there was no clear understanding of how that impacted on other fire safety arrangements within the building, in particular in relation to the compartmentation strategy, the evacuation strategy, the fire alarm and detection system, and how that was aimed to function. And also as part of the compartmentation strategy, the status of the fire doors. So it's a document that helps, I suppose, to wrap all of that information together to provide a consensus view of exactly what you've got, how it needs to be managed, that will not only ensure safety, could also ensure business and property protection if that's one of the criteria that you're looking for as an owner, but it also helps in circumstances where you need to make a change within the building, whether that's a change of use, a change of occupancy, or to extend the building. Knowing what you've got enables you to far more safely design that new element or to make those changes effectively. For example, if you decide to change an office building with a particular type of fire detection alarm system and have some of the floors set as teaching accommodation, you'll understand what system you have in place, what the standard of coverage is, and what needs to be changed to bring it into line with the requirements for an educational building. What do we do about developing them, or where do we get guidance from? Well, there is a document, as Nathan mentioned, PAS 911, Fire Strategies Guidance and Framework for their formation. That document's now been withdrawn, but it is the only reference source really that we have at the moment. Certainly published on a national basis. It's been, as I say, it's been withdrawn by BSI. It appeared when it came up for review. There was no appetite to do so, but the relevant technical fire committees have confirmed that they will incorporate relevant elements into the appropriate British standards to make sure that the principles aren't lost. We look very briefly at what what PAS 911 describes the main benefits of the strategy are, to prompt a full and thorough consideration of fire safety requirements of the premises in question, wider consideration with broader respect or with broader objectives that may include not just life safety, which we have to achieve, but also property protection, business protection, and environmental considerations, to assist in the review of fire system design criteria, to ensure fire protection systems designed support the strategy effectively, provide a framework for future works, and also for ensuring that integrated property measures are effectively considered in multi-occupancy premises. So, for example, where you may have shops and retail outlets on the ground and first floors of a building with some storage associated with it, and then residential accommodation above, making sure that the strategy for both those areas of the business or both those areas of the premises are going to work cooperatively together. Because it may well be that your strategy is that you want to ensure that if there's a fire in one of the retail premises, that there's no need to evacuate the residential premises, in which case you're going to need to ensure that you have effective compartmentation and that you're clear on what the evacuation policies for both of those elements of the premises are. And so having a fire strategy enables you to consider that in advance and make sure that the work that you're doing, either in preparing the designs for a new build, or whether that's refurbishing and changing the use of an existing building, is going to work the way you would hope it would. So here, a commonly asked question that we get posed on a regular basis is that if the organisation is meeting current legislative requirements, both in terms of building regulations and fire legislation, which looks predominantly at life safety. Do I have a fire strategy? And sadly, the answer is no, not directly. Compliance with the building regulations obviously delivers a whole raft of specific requirements, but not necessarily the fire strategy as a whole, because it's really only considering those specific elements that sit within approved document B and those specific building regulation requirements. Similarly with the fire safety order, or the regulatory reform fire safety orders we have in England and Wales, and the similar legislation in other parts of the country. There is an awful lot of information brought together to support a fire risk assessment, which I'll touch on in a bit more detail in a moment. But on its own, it doesn't necessarily provide you with that strategy, that overarching strategy for the building, because the assessment is, I suppose, purely a review of what you've got at the moment, plus some recommendations for making changes where necessary. So within approved document B, as I mentioned, it's the cornerstone, I suppose, of how we deal with safety in our built environment. The functional requirements give us a level to which the building must perform in fire through specific elements of the built environment. And these are really important during the build phase. But what about circumstances where you're already occupying a building? You know, how do you know what you've got? And in the vast majority of cases, sadly, they don't. And similarly, you don't have to use approved document B as the approach you're going to take, because it's very prescriptive and it's really only designed for the more common building situations. But the approved document does list a whole series of alternative approaches you can take, which include, for example, the use of the HTM guidance in healthcare premises or BB100 in schools, for example. But moving on from that, you can also use the approaches that are described in BS 9999 or BS 9991, or you can take a full fire engineered approach. Now, the BS 9999 approach is really sits between that prescriptive requirement and that prescriptive approach to maintaining safety and a full fire engineered solution. But it does allow you to take or make some changes to the standards of fire safety that you're providing based on the holistic approach that you've taken to fire safety in general. So it does provide some benefits. But then beyond that, we also have to consider insurer requirements. And you'll see here a copy of the front cover of approved document B, including or incorporating insurer requirements for property protection, because I think that one of the significant failings in our building system at the moment is that in the vast majority of instances, all we're trying to achieve is that minimum standard of life safety. Now, there's nothing that, I'm not knocking that at all. Of course, we have to ensure that people are safe, but at the same time, we also need to consider those impacts on communities, on businesses, on individuals, on their welfare, that can only really be considered when you start to adopt or implement additional, potentially, or increased standards of safety that are going to provide or ensure a degree of resilience to your building in the event that there is a fire. So there are all of those functional requirements in there, and you can design and develop a building to meet those minimum requirements. But that isn't necessarily, as I suggested earlier, going to give you that full fire strategy that you need to manage the building effectively going forward. And we also see within the building regulations that we have Regulation 38, used to be Regulation 16B. And this is about the provision of fire safety information to the responsible person once the work has been completed, the building work has been completed. Regulation 3A there describes the fire safety information means information related to the design, construction of the building or extension and the services, fitting and equipment provided, etc., etc. The difficulty that we find is that when you speak to a client and you say, well, can you explain to me the standard of fire resistance of the structure of your building, or the strategy, your compartmentation strategy to support the means of escape requirement. Very often through research we've done as an organisation, they're unable to provide you with that level of detail. they don't have that information. Now, it may well be that the contractor has provided them with a full suite of documents and a whole raft of specification documents. However, for the building owner or the building manager, that information, yes, could very well be useful to them. But for the vast majority, they don't have the competence to be able to decipher it or understand exactly what it means. It doesn't provide them with that, I suppose, that simple and easy to understand strategy, which defines how the building functions from a fire safety perspective. If we move on and look at what existing fire legislation says, and as I mentioned, the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, and of course there are different pieces of legislation in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but they all very much require the same thing in real terms. It says that the responsible person must take fire precautions to ensure the safety of employees and anybody on the premises, and again mentions general fire precautions as may reasonably be required to ensure the premises are safe. It then requires a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment to be undertaken. And then also talks about in Article 11, fire safety arrangements to manage the risk of fire. And you know, as I mentioned earlier, a fire risk assessment is going to draw an awful lot of that information together, but it isn't necessarily going to describe those general fire precautions. If we just look at the next slide and we can see exactly what that means. General fire precautions in relation to the premises means measures to reduce the risk of fire on the premises in relation to the means of escape, making sure the means of escape can be used effectively and safely at all times, means for fighting fire, for detecting fire on the premises, and the actions to take in the event of fire. So somewhere, the building owner or the building occupier needs to be able to draw all of this information together so they have a reasonable understanding of how their building functions from a fire safety perspective. And the fire risk assessment will really only use the fire strategy and these general fire precautions to support the work that they're doing. It's almost like auditing the building against the fire strategy, more so than developing the general fire precautions through the fire risk assessment itself. And I think that's an important factor to note, that that strategy needs to be understood by the fire risk assessor. That information needs to be available for them in order that they can undertake the suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment that's required under the legislation to avoid the potential for prosecution. An image there, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, and you know, a very, very sad image it is indeed. But I think for most of us, we'll be aware that following on from that incident, Dame Judith Hackett was asked to do a review of building regulations and fire safety, and she published her report quite some time ago now. However, the government have committed to taking each of the recommendations within that report and implementing them through legislation. And we've seen over recent months the tabling of the Fire Safety Act, which has now become law. And basically that allows for changes to be made to the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order. And then also the draft Building Safety Bill, which is going to change quite significantly the way that we design, construct and manage buildings going forward. Now, sadly, I don't have a lot of time to go into that in any detail, but just for you to be aware that there are going to be specific requirements for gateway points where fire safety information needs to be provided to ensure that a new regulator that's been set up can check that all is in order before they will allow you to move from the design to the construction phase, and to move from the construction phase into the handover and occupation phase. So that these requirements are going to be quite stringent and are going to change the face of the way we do construction. Now, at the moment, the regulations are only going to apply to high-rise residential and other high-risk buildings. But there's been an awful lot of canvassing of government to say, look, this is going to implement a two-tier regime for building safety, and it needs to be considered for implementation more widely. The government haven't said either yes or no to that, but I think they will be minded that change will be required, and that these will have to become a more widespread requirement. Just looking at some of the key responsibilities that have been described by Dame Judith in her report, and as I said, this will be implemented. She's identified several key roles, and here really I've only focused on clients, principal designers and principal contractors. However, there are specific requirements for fire risk assessors, building safety managers, et cetera, all the way through. And what's important I think to recognise here is that there's some real clarity being brought to bear in that the clients need to establish information management systems. Principal designers need to compile full plans documentation. Principal contractors need to ensure at completion that they can demonstrate that the work meets the requirements of the building regulations. And yes, as I mentioned earlier, there is an opportunity just to say, look, here's all of the documentation associated with this building. Here we are, client, you can have that now. But that information isn't going to be, I suppose, easily enough understood for them to be able to really understand how their building functions effectively without some help and support. And that's really where the fire strategy comes into play. There's also this requirement for a golden thread of information. And this really, I suppose, reflects back on the Regulation 38 that I mentioned earlier within the building regulations. But this is a proposed change to control the process and associated record keeping requirements, and linking to the recommendation for a digital record for every building, or as Dame Judith had called it, a golden thread of information. And it will include a whole range of things: regulatory, design, construction, management of the building functions, duty holders, i.e. those responsible for the premises, will need to manage that information, update it, and move it forward to new owners should that happen. And all of this information must be available to the regulator if they request it. However, there's also a requirement, or there also will be a requirement, that for existing buildings, that information is drawn together. And I think that's why we're seeing now as an organisation this sudden influx of requests for retrospective fire strategies, because so many organisations do not understand the premises that they're managing, the premises that they own, and how everything fits together. And they need somebody competent to come in and help them with that. And as you can see there, one of the recommendations within the review was that duty holders must identify and record where gaps in the above information exist, and the strategy for updating that information. So you've got to bring it together, you've got to identify gaps, and you've got to then fill those gaps effectively. So moving forward, we are going to see a change. We are going to see the need for this information to be brought together in a sensible, holistic way, and that is easily understandable. So what a fire strategy is not. I think we've explored existing regulation, existing legislation, and the part that they have to play. But we also get asked, well, I've got a fire safety management plan. Is that my fire strategy? Or I've got a compartmentation strategy. Is that my fire strategy? Or my fire risk assessment? And sadly, although they all have a role to play within the overall strategy for safety of the building, they aren't the end product that they need to be, sadly. Fire safety and fire safety arrangements in a premises are complex, and this is just a sort of a quick mind map that I put together, which just looks at some of those elements that need to be considered during design, during construction, during the management of the premises, which all have interlinking aspects. Whether that be the fundamentals of the building, its layout, the occupant type, the height of the building, or whether it be some of the escape issues associated with escape routes, their inspection and maintenance, the evacuation strategy for the building. But you can look at any one of those elements and see where the linkages lie. For example, your evacuation strategy is going to be linked to the compartmentation strategy for the building, to smoke ventilation, to the detection systems. And again, providing a end user or a building owner or client with a specification for their alarm system is great, but it doesn't necessarily tell them how that fits in with everything else that goes on within the building, and they clearly need to understand that. But different people will have different requirements in terms of what they need to understand, whether they be the client or the owner of the building, the designer, the builder, the occupiers, the building safety manager, or the assessors. They all have different need requirements, but the one underpinning element, I suppose, is that they need to have a good understanding of how all of these systems and elements work together to provide a safe premises. This is an example of a compartmentation strategy for a large building in London. And as you can see, it's incredibly complex. Now, if this wasn't a presentation, I can zoom in. It would show you that in addition just to the compartmentation lines that are marked, all the other fire safety features have been identified on the plan. The locations of emergency lights, signs, fire alarm panels, detectors, etc., etc. And you could argue, well, this provides you with a strategy, doesn't it? Because it gives you all the information you need. And yes, to a certain extent it does, but it doesn't tell you necessarily how all of those facets work together. And one of the interesting points here, I think, is that some work we've done with a healthcare provider, a private healthcare provider, who have a primary authority arrangement with one of the fire and rescue services. And in discussions with them, they've made it very, very clear that without a compartmentation strategy and a compartmentation plan for their building, there's no way that you can do a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment, which straight away points to the fact that it's not okay just to turn up at a building and undertake that fire risk assessment. You need to understand how it's been set up to function and how all of the separate facets that make the fire safety arrangements what they are will work together to ensure the safety of the building and the safety in particular of those occupants. As I said, we undertake lots of different of work for different organisations in completing fire safety strategy, including for some of our own buildings. However, I think that our experience has shown, and to reiterate points that I've made earlier, that for the vast majority of organisations, they don't have this information to hand. They can't lay their hands on the information, even to help you on certain occasions develop the fire strategy competently. And it does require an awful lot of research in order to enable you to bring that information together for them. However, as I say, retrospective fire strategies, I think, are something that are going to be a requirement moving forward, particularly for the high rise and high risk buildings. But certainly in circumstances where you've also got mixed use premises, a similar requirement will exist to ensure that you can fully understand what you've got and how it functions. But here's an interesting question. A compliant building may not deliver any function post-incident. And why is that? Well, the reasons are relatively straightforward, because compliance only looks at life safety. It makes little or no reference to business continuity or property protection at all. And for certain organisations, it's not uncommon that in the event of a fire, that business can no longer operate effectively. And there seems to be no good reason for that, because if steps are taken in advance during design work or even during refurbishment work to better establish how you actually want the building to perform in the event of fire and what you expect the outcomes to be, then you're in a far better position to ensure that post-fire you have something to go back to. And that doesn't necessarily need to be, specifically related to a business selling widgets or somebody providing services. But if you think about circumstances where a school is lost, it's not just the building that's damaged, but all of the schoolwork that's stored there might be lost. And any amenity that it provides to the local community will be lost. So there are significant additional I suppose, knock-on effects of a fire that aren't necessarily considered if we only look for that compliance route and we only go for the minimum standard of life safety. So commonly, the starting point for a fire strategy is trying to detect or understand what the desired predictable fire outcome is going to be. In other words, if you have a fire, what have you designed the building to deliver post-fire? And there's certain things, certain elements you can look at. Of course, achieving the minimum legislative requirements for the safety of occupants, but you can also prescribe limitations on the extent of fire spread based on the potential fire loading of the building and the standard of compartmentation and fire resistance you design, or limitation on operational impact. So if you lose one production line, you don't lose the second production line, for example. So you minimise risk and minimise loss and minimise functionality in that way. Or you can also have consider what the time to resumption of normal operations will be. And very commonly when you're designing a new build or you're refurbishing an existing building, those sorts of considerations need to be drawn into discussions on the basis for establishing appropriate measures that are going to ensure the required outcome. So the elements that a fire strategy should consider are the built environment, the use of the premises, the occupancy, both in terms of type and number, and also the management of the building. It's important that all of those elements are considered. And just looking at each of those in turn very quickly. The built environment, building regulations should, or fire engineering should deliver life safety, but is that enough? Maybe not. You need to consider the client's appetite for risk. Will the built environment deliver the desired predictable outcome? And what other elements can enhance the possibility of the building surviving a fire? And there are lots of things to consider there, whether that's enhanced protection through the provision of sprinklers or drencher systems in certain areas, specialist protection to particular area of the buildings that need to ensure that they maintain safe if there's a fire elsewhere on the premises. And there's just an example with modular construction. I'm sure you've all seen these kinds of buildings go up. It's just a few stills of a hotel being built. But you can also see the kinds of voids and service penetrations that are created during that construction phase. But when you look at the finished building from the outside, and maybe even from the inside, it'd be very, very difficult to tell that that's a modular building and it's been built in a certain way. And so ensuring that the safety requirements are effective retrospectively is almost impossible unless you understand exactly how the building's been designed and built and what it's been built from. Similarly, with structural insulated panels, we're seeing far more prevalent use of this kind of construction technique. But we're using some really unpleasant plastics, expanded plastics, to provide insulation, but in the event of a fire will and could create a fairly significant blaze, which could lead to complete loss of the building. Now, that's not to say that if they're kept in good condition, they won't provide a degree of protection and resistance. But in circumstances, as you can see here, the moment you start to expose the insulation material through chasing in for light switches or whatever else, is the moment that a weakness is introduced. And it's understanding those elements that it's so important. So the use of the building, what goes on inside the building, how critical is this to the business? How is this activity likely to change during the lifetime of the building? All of these things need to be considered in advance, because in that way you can future-proof the building. You can better understand how you're going to protect certain facets of it, or whether there's an overarching strategy that needs to be applied for a building that is in multi-occupancy. Occupancy, sadly, is commonly more so part of the problem than the solution, because experience shows that in the vast majority of incidents or fire incidents, they're commonly people related, either through accident or error or mistake or intransigence. But understanding how people think, what motivates them in the environment they're going to be in, and how they may react is vital to that strategy, because it's got to be considered in the mix. So you need to understand who will be in the premises, how many of them there will be, are they familiar with the premises, what tasks will they be undertaking, how mobile are they, will they have been trained, how will evacuation be supported, because all of these things have a significant impact, predominantly on the life safety, and the safety of the occupants, but also has the potential to impact on other factors if you don't get the strategy exactly right. So this is just a list of an outline strategy content, and really just to provide, I suppose, a bit of a review as to the sort of elements that need to be within that strategy, the sort of things that need to be considered. So what's the scope of the strategy? Which part of the building does it encompass? Does it encompass the entire building, or there are elements that are missing or haven't been covered? What legislation is in place and in force for that particular type of premises, description of the building, how means of escape and warning is handled, the evacuation strategy, all of the fire safety facilities in terms of active and passive fire protection, whether that be fire spread looking at linings or the structure, how external fire spread is handled, what fire service access looks like, etc., etc. But in addition to that, also that fire safety management element. How is that all going to be managed? Because very often you can manage out problems if you understand the problem initially. You can manage that problem away without the need for there to be any additional fire protection installed. Not always, but on certain occasions it can be. And what we often find is that certainly with the retrospective strategies that we do, there's also a gap analysis at the end of that. So we understand what the client is trying to achieve or what they hope their building provides them. But commonly, it doesn't satisfy 100%. And so there will be a gap analysis as part of the strategy development, which just says that in order for your strategy to function effectively, there are several changes that you're going to need to make. And that really is just I suppose, a diagram which explains exactly the same issues. You've got the built environment on one side, which looks at the building design element, how it's tested and maintained, and its inspection. You look at the evacuation plan and the managed environment through the risk assessment, staff training, evacuation exercises, reviews of fire risk assessments, and then also how change is managed effectively. But they all feed into this wider fire strategy requirement. But then we also have to make this contingency for business continuity. Research that's been undertaken through an organisation called Risk Authority. Now, many of you might not be familiar with Risk Authority, but it's basically a research scheme that is funded by insurers, that is administered by the FPA, and we keep what we call large loss data, which is records of any fires that have led to a loss in excess of £100,000. And looking back, we have found that over a 10-year period, the average loss for a fire in the UK comes in at £657,074. And if you were to speak to insurers more widely, you will see that although the number of fires is decreasing and the number of deaths and injuries is decreasing, the losses from fire is increasing significantly. And we do need to take this on board. We do need to ensure that we're not just designing buildings to that minimum life safety requirement, but also ensuring a degree of resilience to the property. And there's just an example here of a case study, a multi-storey car park. The structure was designed to comply with the building regulations and approved document B. Although the travel distances are in excess of requirements, heat detection was provided to mitigate, but there were several associated risks that were not addressed, sadly. The primary use was for hospital parking, but then a sports stadium was built adjacent. Subsequently, there was no consideration for additional people with reduced mobility, which is likely from a healthcare premises, no coherent plan for management of evacuation, and a massive evacuation after a sport event was not addressed. And if all of those issues had been considered at the time, then the problems that they now find themselves trying to deal with through a managed approach could have very simply have been avoided, really quite simply. I'm going to skip on from that because that's just about analysis really, more so than anything else. But looking back at this key roles and key responsibilities, one of the other issues that's become evident and very, very clear is that the requirement for competency of all those involved in the design, construction and management of buildings has come into sharp focus. And there have been several working groups developed, competency criteria being developed, British standards being developed in support to ensure that competency can be proved throughout the build process. And through the design process and through the management of the building. And competency comes in all different types of, in all different forms. Just a couple of examples there of where somebody understands on the left-hand side that they need to fit an intumescent fire collar around this plastic pipe. They haven't quite grasped the fact that unless the collar is tight to the wall, which they couldn't achieve in this instance, that it's not going to serve any purpose. So clearly an element of competence, but not full competence. And it's these kinds of issues that we are going to need to address going forward. In her review of the fire safety and building safety, Dame Judith Hackett said, an outcomes-based framework requires people who are part of the system to be competent, to think for themselves rather than blindly follow guidance, and to deliver or to understand the responsibilities to deliver and maintain safety and integrity throughout the life cycle of the building. And it's important here that we understand this is about thinking for themselves rather than blindly following guidance. And the difficulty we find ourselves in is that although we have a huge amount of information about our built environment and about our buildings, we don't necessarily have, or we're not necessarily presenting that information in a way that people can understand, that people have the competency to be able to implement and deliver. And again, that's where the fire strategy really comes into place. So drafting and development of the strategy is a common misconception that, you know, a fire strategy can only really be developed by a chartered fire engineer, which is to a certain degree nonsense. You know, if you're looking to apply to a new build or refurbishment project, or even a retrospective fire strategy, just application of approved document B or BS 9999, a competent fire consultant or a competent fire risk assessor will be able to support that work. However, if there is a full fire engineered solution required, then of course you'd need to speak to and get support from a chartered fire engineer. But it's very much horses for courses, and it's very much based around competency. And against the reason for that emphasis, you need to ensure that we're using competent people to help us with this work. And if we're developing strategies, again, to ensure we've got competent support to help us do that. As an organisation, we've been running a Know Your Building campaign, precisely because we recognise that so many building owners and occupiers don't know what they've got. There is a lot of free information on the website under the Know Your Building tag, which helps or will help and in support building owners, designers, developers and managers to develop a comprehensive understanding of their buildings from a fire safety perspective, to raise awareness of the need for systems and equipment maintenance, whether that's passive or active. We're also trying to influence government in their thinking and support fire and rescue services as they try and raise awareness with building residents of the need for them to fully understand what their fire evacuation policies are and how to act and behave appropriately in the event that the fire alarm sounds. But one of the things we've also developed is the blind spot calculator tool, and this enables organisations to really undertake a completely anonymous survey, just which helps them look at their own understanding of what they've got. And the results are really quite interesting when they've been shared with us from time to time. And again, the vast majority of building owners of existing premises do not fully understand how their building works together. But those resources are there for people who are looking for more information and more advice. It's all free, entirely free of charge. There's a new podcast which we've introduced, 4 or 5 episodes now published on all the usual streaming services. Again, trying to help people to understand what the specific requirements are of existing legislation, what the changed requirements are going to look like, in order to support their competency, but in also, more so than anything else, help them to better understand what they've got. That's it from me. I know that was an incredibly quick run through, but I hope that it's provided you with, I suppose, sufficient information to understand what a fire strategy is all about, why there's a requirement for it, how you might at the moment think you have a fire strategy, but you probably don't, and also maybe just to encourage those within the design and construct communities to think in a little more detail about their approach to design, their approach to construction, their liaison with their client, in terms of what the desired outcomes for this building actually are, rather than just trying to meet those minimum life safety requirements. Thank you very much.
Brilliant.
I'm going to hand back to Nathan now.
Thank you very much, Howard. One quick question before we probably break for lunch, if that's okay. We've got a fire engineer. This is a question from Ian Maddox. A fire engineer design is very specific to a building. How will building owners and even fire risk assessors and auditors know if a change will compromise or void the fire engineering solution? This will require specific knowledge and competency to access the changes that affect the fire engineer.
Absolutely, and quite correct and a really good question. I think that at the moment, for the vast majority of building owners, they don't necessarily understand what they've got. And that becomes even more prevalent in circumstances where a fire engineered approach has been taken. Now, our experience shows that for the vast majority of buildings, there are very few, other than sort of higher profile buildings, if you're talking about the Shard, for example, in London, or some of these taller, more prestigious buildings, which have taken a full fire engineered approach to design. That in vast majority of instances, fire engineering has been used to solve a problem in an existing building or to provide a solution to a difficult scenario. And sadly, and I know there's not time to talk about this in too much detail here, there has in the past, and I could show you examples of fire engineers who are almost working towards a value engineered solution for their clients. They're looking for an opportunity to save money. Now, I've got nothing against saving money as long as you're not reducing fire safety, I suppose. But again, I think the answer to the question comes down to, if you've got a building that has any element of fire engineering in it, and there's a need to change it, then you will have to engage with a competent fire engineer to help you unravel what you have in order to ensure that what you do going forward is appropriate. And you could argue the same for a simple change to an existing building where you're moving there's a change of use, and you need to understand what you have to do with your fire detection and alarm system as a result of that change to bring it up where you bring it to the standard that you need, whether that's through location of detectors, whether that come down to the functionality of the fire alarm panel, whether it comes down to the type of detection you're using in certain locations. Again, you're going to need competent individuals to help advise and support you with that. The difficulty, again, that we find, and I keep coming back to the same point, is that many organisations don't know what they've got. And I'll go into a building to undertake a fire strategy or to do a fire risk assessment, and I'll say, can you show me the completion certificate for your fire alarm system? And the answer is no, we don't have it. And so as an assessor, I have to make an assumption as to the standard of the fire detection and alarm system based on a visual inspection. And sadly, that's just not good enough, because if you want to make change, you can't go basing it on assumptions. You need the solid facts to help you with that decision-making process.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Howard. That was great. And obviously, if anyone wants to come back to you for more information, they can find you via the Fire Protection Association.
Absolutely.
And brilliant. Thank you very much for that.
And thanks again for inviting me.
No worries, and hopefully we'll see you in October at the NEC.
I do hope so.
Good stuff. Just to remind everyone, there's the final instalment of the Considerate Constructor Scheme at 3 o'clock. That's our next session. 3:30, our final session is net zero for commercial spaces, commercial industrial estates. And also just to remind people as well that you can book meetings with suppliers and exhibitors on here all day as well. So after lunch, perhaps that'd be a good way to spend the afternoon. Brilliant. All right. Cheers, Howard.
Thanks very much. Cheerio, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.